So tonight's the last session of our 2020-2021 season. It's a bonus session. We've never done one in June before. We're soon going to be publishing the full schedule for next year, which will start in September. We previewed a few of our speakers for next season last month. I'll just mention some others that we have booked. So Jim Hessler will be returning to the roundtable to talk about the life and times of Dan Sickles, the self-declared hero of Gettysburg. Caroline Newhall will be talking about an interesting topic, which is the treatment of Black prisoners of war by the Confederacy. As you know, once Black prisoners began to be taken in 1863, presented a lot of difficulties for the Confederacy and for the Union. Neil Chatelain, who's a retired Navy officer, is going to speak to us on a subject that's usually talked about from the Union perspective, which is naval operations in the Mississippi River Valley. And he's going to talk about the Confederate Navy, and in particular, its pretty aggressive plan when it started out the war. And finally, Lorian Foote's going to talk about how retaliation was employed by both sides when it came to bushwhackers, guerrillas, and prisoners. It's pretty interesting story, and there's a lot to it, much of which is me. As with all of our Zoom sessions, we ask that you stay on mute while the speaker presents. If you have questions, use the chat function below to write them in. We'll have a Q&A at the end, and I'll give questions to Dan based on that. Now, tonight's speaker is Dan Welch, who's joining us for the first time. The actions of General George Greene and his New York Brigade on the night of July 2nd, 1863, were as important, or in some views more important, to holding the Union line than the much better known action at Little Round Top at the other end of the line earlier that day. Dan shines a well-deserved spotlight on those events. And I'm very excited about the presentation because George Greene happens to be one of my favorite characters out of the Civil War, one of those lesser-known Civil War figures who was outstanding during the war and had a fascinating and long career both before and after. Dan's a seasonal park ranger at Gettysburg National Military Park, and he just arrived there a couple of days ago, so he's actually speaking to us from Gettysburg. He was education program coordinator for the Gettysburg Foundation, author of The Last Road North, a guide to the Gettysburg campaign, and he's also very active in the Mahoning Valley Civil War Roundtable, where he resides during the rest of the year. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dan.
Well, thank you, Mark, for such a great introduction, and I'm very honored and happy to be with your roundtable this evening. And as Mark said, I am a seasonal park ranger here at Gettysburg National Military Park. I've been doing that for the past 13 years now, and I'm actually coming to you live this evening from inside the Henry Spangler House. And the Henry Spangler House and farm is situated along Seminary Ridge. It would see the Florida Brigade under the command of David Lang on the afternoon and evening of July 2nd pass over this property, and then it would see Kemper's Brigade during Pickett's Charge pass over this property on July 3rd the next day. So a lot of history within this house that I'm coming to you from this evening. And with that in mind, we are going to be talking about Gettysburg and an action, as Mark said, that's not regularly talked about this evening. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen to get started with the presentation tonight. And as I do so, it's great that you're going to be having Jim Hessler to come on to the round table and talk to you about Dan Sickles, because believe it or not, even though our program is going to focus on George Greene tonight, we are going to be talking at the very beginning of the program about none other than Dan Sickles. So if Mark, if you could give me a heads up here, make sure that you can see the screen.
Yep.
All right, wonderful. We'll go ahead and get started. So tonight's program, we're going to begin, as I mentioned, with a little introduction from this gentleman, Major General Daniel E. Sickles. General Sickles will become the self-proclaimed hero of Gettysburg in the years following the battle and the decades following the battle. And he's a very flamboyant... very flamboyant, very arrogant man, if you will, and so he takes a lot of credit for what happens at Gettysburg. He's wounded on July 2nd. He loses a leg to that injury. He won't come back to a combat role for the rest of the war after his wounding here at Gettysburg, but he really takes a lot of credit for the Union Army winning the Battle of Gettysburg and for him claiming key and important ground that his commanding officer, George Meade, did not consider or wouldn't let him take. So for a man like General Sickles to share the spotlight with somebody else and their contributions at the Battle of Gettysburg is truly saying something. And General Sickles would say this about George Sears Greene and his fight at Culp's Hill on the evening of July 2nd, 1863, at the dedication of the monument to Greene at the summit of Culp's Hill in the post-war years. Sickles said this. He said, "The battle fought here by General Greene on the night of July 2nd, 1863, to hold possession of Culp's Hill has a conspicuous place in history. It is memorable not so much for the number of the combatants engaged as it is for the skill of the general, the heroic conduct of his troops, and in view of the consequences that would have followed the defeat of the Union forces." So General Sickles speaks high praise of George Sears Greene and his much forgotten actions at Culp's Hill in the 20th and 21st century during the battle on July 2nd, 1863. But who was George Sears Greene? Well, I can say in a very summative way that Greene leads a fascinating life before the war. He performs yeoman service during the Civil War and will continue a lifetime of service in many different avenues after the war. Greene was born in Rhode Island on May 6th, 1801. So think about that for a second. George Sears Greene is well into his 60s during the Battle of Gettysburg here in 1863. Greene comes from a very famous lineage. He's a direct descendant of a pioneer who helped Roger Williams settle the colony of Rhode Island. His ancestors would serve as a governor of the state, a lieutenant governor of the state, a U.S. senator from Rhode Island, and a justice of the Supreme Court. And Greene's lineage also includes Revolutionary War General Nathaniel Greene. Greene is going to be educated in Rhode Island in the town of Warwick, and then he'll go to Latin school in Providence, and he's slated to go to Brown University. But unfortunately, as he's getting ready to go off and go to college, the family faces a number of financial setbacks. And so there's no funding, there's no money for Greene to be able to go on to Brown University. So he's got to find a job. And Greene moves to New York City, and he finds a job at a dry goods merchant office. While he's there working, however, Greene doesn't give up on his desire to continue his education, and he'll soon be offered an appointment at the United States Military Academy. He'll enter West Point at the age of 18, and he will graduate number 2 in his class of 79 with high honors. Following his graduation from West Point, he will serve as a lieutenant of artillery. After having some field service, he'll come back to West Point and become an instructor of mathematics for a short stint for about 4 years. And while he's there, he will marry the sister of a classmate of his, a woman by the name of Elizabeth Vinton, in 1828. They begin to have a family, and it's pretty soon George and his wife Elizabeth have 3 children, and George is going to be transferred out of West Point, and he's going to be stationed in a fort in Maine known as Fort Sullivan between 1832 and 1833. And what happens during this period of Greene's life will greatly shape the remainder of his life. During his time of service at Fort Sullivan in Maine, his wife, Elizabeth, and all 3 of his children that came with him to the fort will pass away. It is a devastating loss for Greene. And to deal with that loss, we all deal with grief and loss in our own way. Greene returned back to something that always was a passion for him, and that was the acquisition of knowledge, learning, and education. So while he's continuing his duty at Fort Sullivan, Greene pours himself into studying both the fields of medicine and law. And within 3 years of this pivotal moment, this tragic moment in Greene's life, he will resign his commission with the United States Army, and he was prepared to take both the bar exam and the medical board exam. And not only will he take those exams, but he will pass both of them. So within 3 years, can you imagine studying to become a lawyer and a medical professional and being able to pass both of those in one fell swoop? But despite receiving this education and doing this training and passing these exams, Greene is going to continue to acquire more knowledge and acquire more skills. And he'll instead choose to work as a civil engineer, working in such places as railroads, as well as working on Central Park in New York City, its layout, and many other construction type projects. By the end of the 1830s, he's married again. He's married a woman by the name of Martha Barrett Dana, and he will have numerous children with her. And 3 of his 4 sons that he'll have with his wife Martha will end up serving in the military during times of war. Now, when the Civil War breaks out in 1861, Greene is, 60 years old. He's not really considering going back, despite all the calls by the president, Abraham Lincoln, for volunteers, for former officers to come back to train troops as the country mobilizes for this war effort. He decides to stay with his family in New York City. But finally, in January of 1862, Greene feels he can't sit on the sidelines anymore. And so he will volunteer for service, and he will be assigned as the colonel of the 60th New York Infantry. Greene will rapidly rise through the ranks. Within several months of becoming colonel of the 60th New York, he'll be promoted to brigadier general, and he will command a brigade of soldiers in the Shenandoah Valley. By August of 1862, just 7 months into his time in the Union Army during the Civil War, he will fight at Cedar Mountain. And because of casualties during the battle, he will temporarily command a division of Union soldiers. And then he'll continue to lead that division as the month of August unfolds and more campaigns heat up, and he will take these men to the Battle of Second Manassas or Second Bull Run at the end of August of 1862, and then to Antietam on September 17th, 1862. But by the time of the spring of 1863, Greene has returned back to brigade command and will be in that position as such at the Battle of Chancellorsville. Now, tonight we're going to be looking at Greene's actions here at Gettysburg on the evening of July 2nd, 1863. But I want to just take a moment and tell you a little bit more about what happens to Greene after Gettysburg, since we'll be sticking to 1863 for the remainder of the evening. Greene will continue service after the fighting here at Gettysburg. Greene's brigade is part of the Union Army's 12th Corps. The Union Army's 11th and 12th Corps in the fall of 1863 will be transferred to the Western Theater, and he will go along with them with the rest of his corps. In the early stages of the effort to relieve Chattanooga in the fall of 1863, he will receive a severe wound to the face at the Battle of Wauhatchie on October 29th, 1863. The bullet will penetrate his jaw, it will break his jaw, and it will knock numerous teeth out of his mouth. It is a very severe wound. He'll have to have significant operations to repair the damage that he received from that wound, and it essentially knocks George Sears Greene out of the war effort until to the spring of 1864, which at that time he's going to be assigned an administrative and court-martial duties until he's fully recovered. So by the time Greene returns back to the field, it is the end of the American Civil War in the spring of 1865, when he will join up with William Tecumseh Sherman's army for the conclusion of the Carolina campaign that will end in May of 1865. As the war comes to a conclusion, he will receive a brevet for all of his service and be brevetted to Major General from his rank of Brigadier General during the war, and he will muster out officially from the Army on April 30th, 1866. Greene will go back to his pre-war job of engineering. He'll work on a number of different construction projects around New England and New York City and the state of New York. He'll be the founder and president of the American Society of Civil Engineers. He'll work in such cities under that auspice as New York, Washington, Detroit, Troy, and Yonkers. His work will include water and sewer systems, streets, and elevated railways in the later half of the 19th century. And when Greene finally passes away, he will have been the oldest living graduate of West Point upon his death. And one other side note I'd like to tell you about Greene is that his notoriety and service in the Civil War is not singular. As I said, 3 of his 4 sons will serve during the American Civil War. And one of his sons, Samuel Dana Greene, some of you may recognize that name, was actually an executive officer on the Monitor and will be president on the Monitor during her fight with the Merrimack. So Greene's family has a long history of service to this country all the way up to and through the American Civil War. Now, by the time General Greene gets here to Gettysburg, he's been in the service again. He's had this field command for the last 18, 19 months or so. And there's a great description I want to share with you of what General Greene looked like, what he acted like, what he was like during the Gettysburg campaign and here at Gettysburg. One soldier said that General Greene's personal appearance at this time was about 62 years old. He was thick-set, 5 feet 10 inches high, of dark complexion, iron gray hair, full of gray beard and mustache, gruff in manner, and stern in appearance, but withal an excellent officer and, under a rough exterior, possessing a kind heart. In the end, the men learned to love and respect him as much as in the beginning they feared him. And this was saying a good deal on the subject. He knew how to drill, how to command, and in the hour of peril, how to care for his command, and the men respected him accordingly. So who were these men that Greene commanded here at Chancellorsville, at Gettysburg? George Sears Greene Brigade consisted of 5 regiments, all from the state of New York, including the 60th New York Volunteer Infantry, which he was originally assigned as colonel upon enlisting in the Army in January of 1862, the 78th New York, 102nd New York, 137th New York, and the 149th New York Volunteer Infantry regiments. These 5 different regiments would have soldiers representing numerous counties and cities across the state of New York, including Ogdensburg, New York City, Buffalo, Rochester, Utica, and Binghamton. Now, before we bring General Sears here to Gettysburg and we bring his 5 New York regiments with him to Culp's Hill, we need to take a step back and understand what's going on the first day of the Battle of Gettysburg and what the situation looks like on Culp's Hill as that day comes to an end. Now, for the Union Army of the Potomac, at the end of July 1st, about 4:30 in the afternoon, the 2 corps of the Army of the Potomac, the 1st Corps and 11th Corps, have been defeated west and north of the town of Gettysburg. A retreat will begin. These units will make their way as best they can through the town of Gettysburg, and they begin to take a new position on Cemetery Hill. That position will continue to grow and extend as more soldiers from the fight west and north of town continue to make their retreat back to this fallback position that 11th Corps Commander Oliver Otis Howard had selected earlier in July 1st during the fight. Many of these units are going to start to arrive to this area, and particularly to Culp's Hill, at about 5:30 p.m. And once they arrive there, they begin to do something that we haven't seen a lot of in the Eastern theater of the war thus far, and that is the construction of breastworks. These units that are arriving to Culp's Hill as the sun is beginning to set on July 1st, 1863, are soldiers from the Union Army's 1st Corps, regiments of the famed Iron Brigade, men from Wisconsin, Indiana, and Michigan, as well as men from Lysander's Cutler's Brigade, men from New York and Pennsylvania. These 2 brigades had really opened the infantry fighting on the morning of July 1st, 1863, and these two brigades had just been mauled in the fighting. Their casualties were horrendous. These units were just shadows of themselves by the time they would get to Culp's Hill and begin to construct those entrenchments. Now, as the sun finally sets on July 1st, more Union soldiers are arriving to the field that had not witnessed the fighting earlier in the day. One of those units was a division of the 12th Corps under the command of John Geary. John Geary's division will camp for the evening on the northern slopes of Little Round Top. But at about 5 a.m. on the morning of July 2nd, Geary's division will be ordered to move to extend the right flank of the Union Army's position on Culp's Hill. By the dawn of July 2nd, we now see an extension of soldiers from Geary's division, including George Sears Greene's New Yorkers, here on Culp's Hill. Greene recalled arriving to this new position that morning. In his official report of the battle, he wrote that we took position at about 6 a.m. on the crest of a steep and rocky hill, being thrown back at nearly right angles with the line of the 1st Corps. Rock Creek, as you can see here on the map in the distance, running past our front, was about a distance of 200 to 400 yards. Our position and front were covered with a heavy growth of timber, free from undergrowth, with large ledges projecting above the surface. These rocks and trees offered good cover for marksmen. The surface was very steep on our left, diminishing to a gentle slope on our right. As soon as we were in position, we began to entrench ourselves and throw up breastworks of covering height of logs, cordwood, stones, and earth. The same was done by the troops on our right. So upon Greene's arrival here, Greene's men will begin to entrench themselves. They're digging breastworks, much like the units had the previous evening from the 1st Corps. As more units arrive to Culp's Hill, they'll continue to extend this line of battle on the Union Army's right flank further to the southeast. And as they do so, they are also beginning to construct earthworks and trenches. Now, the position that Greene occupies here, which roughly becomes around the center of the line of the Culp's Hill position, had a lot of natural strength to it to protect these men from any assault that may come their way from the Confederate Army. The 60th New York, here on the left of Greene's line, and the 78th New York, they'll later move, but really the 60th New York on the left end of Greene's line has a really strong position as an anchor because the terrain in front of them out here is extremely steep. The ground rises, if you're a Confederate, the ground rises very, very quickly. If you're a Union soldier in the position, the ground drops off precipitously in front of you. In addition to that, not only is the ground incredibly steep, but for many of you that are familiar with the famous boulders at Devil's Den down by Little Round Top here at Gettysburg, those same size boulders litter the landscape in front of the left end of Greene's line here by the 60th New York. But as Greene's line stretches further to the south and east, that steepness declines. So the right end of Greene's line is not as strong naturally as the left end of Greene's line is. To give you an idea just how much it drops off, between the 60th New York's position and the far right end of Greene's line with the 137th New York, there's a 90-degree drop in elevation. In addition to this, Greene also has a tough time manning this position. The length of Greene's line is about 1,500 feet for these 5 regiments. And although that doesn't sound like much, these 5 regiments have been through the war. They have experienced the attrition that battle and illness will have on any organized body of soldiers. So it's a large line. The right end of his line is much lower than the left end. And although there's some natural strength to it towards the left end, Greene isn't 100% satisfied with his position. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. But once he gets his men here and they begin to construct those earthworks, he's going to send out a number of skirmishers. And you can see them here out towards Rock Creek, these little blue dots. Skirmishers are like the advanced warning system for an army in position. They are a buffer between the two lines of these opposing armies, these opposing lines of battle, and they are the early warning system letting the main line of battle know that an attack may be coming. General Greene, ordered by his divisional commander, John Geary, will put together a force of about 170 men taken from the 60th New York, and he will send them out under Lieutenant Colonel John Reddington out here to Rock Creek. But John Geary, the division commander, looks at that and says, you know what, I don't think that's a strong enough divisional line. So he'll send out the 28th Pennsylvania to bolster the line as well. But a little later in the day in our story, the 28th will be recalled, and the 60th New York will be out here on the line all alone. One of the members that joined the 60th New York out there on the skirmish line on the morning and afternoon of July 2nd was a man by the name of Henry Bayliss. He wrote this of that moment just 4 days after the battle. He said, "We took our position on the right on the 2nd, and we sent out skirmishers in the front. I was one of them. We went about a quarter of a mile from our lines in a piece of woods. There was nothing but large trees and no underbrush, with lots of large rocks to hide behind." By 12 o'clock on July 2nd, this new line, the right end of the Union Army of the Potomac at Gettysburg, will consist of about 8,600 soldiers behind a solid line of strong earthenworks or trenches. But how the strength of this position developed, how these trenches were built, is going to be what we're going to transition to next. Now, the Iron Brigade and Lysander Cutler's Brigade of the First Corps, they begin to throw up trenches very quickly upon their arrival to Culp on the evening of July 1st at about 5:30 p.m. on the northern slopes of the hill itself. And after the arrival of Greene's brigade at about 6 a.m., 5:30, 6 a.m. on the morning of July 2nd, Greene, as well as the other brigade commanders in his division, Colonel Charles Candy and Colonel George Cobham's brigade, they're also going to start building trenches. Now, as to the reason why they start to build them, there's orders that are going to filter down to the individual regiments to begin to construct them, largely due in part to what Greene will say about their importance and the strength of his position. Captain Collins of the 149th New York, and this is a post-war image of him here on the left of your screen, he will write about the decision to build earthworks within this brigade and how it's going to affect the rest of the line. He said General Geary, who's the division commander, called a conference of his brigade commanders, so including Greene and Candy and George Cobham. And it was understood, Collins said, that it submitted to them was the question of building rifle pits. And Greene would vocalize his concerns. As the conference is underway, Captain Collins remembered that General Geary, Greene's boss, expressed himself as adverse to the practice of building them on the ground that it unfitted men for fighting without them. So what John Geary is saying, look, if we build these defensive positions and the men are well protected behind them, they'll get used to this and they'll no longer want to stand shoulder to shoulder and march across these open fields and fight out in the open. So Geary says, let's not do it. Let's not ruin these men's discipline. Let's not give them the protection here. So he's adverse to it. But at this point, General Greene pipes up in the conference. And Collins recorded the moment. He said General Greene was credited with replying that the saving of life was of far more consequence to him than any theories as to breastworks, and that so far as his men were concerned, they would have them if they had the time to build them. And so after this conference, early in the morning of July 2nd, Greene comes back to his men. The other brigade commanders do as well. And the orders filter down the lines through the regiments to begin to construct earthworks. Colonel Louis Stegman of the 102nd New York in Greene's brigade recalled that moment upon arriving to their position and receiving Greene's order to construct these earthworks. He said, quote, "Immediately on our arrival, by order of General Greene, who personally superintended the work," remember Greene is a civil engineer before the war, "the men commenced to construct earthworks. The works were finished by noon, and many a man who sits before me today," he's writing 30, 40 years later, "grumbled that morning and afternoon at the persistency of Pop Greene, their term of endearment, and prophesied that they would have labors for their pains. Before many hours, they rendered thanks and blessings for the skillful plans and judgment of their beloved commander." So Stegman of the 102nd New York is saying, listen, the orders go out along the line, and these men are just complaining and groaning and griping about having to dig, having to gather up stones, having to cut down timber, cut down logs. I mean, this is back-breaking work. And we know that the temperature will reach 87 degrees on July 2nd, 1863 here at Gettysburg. We're unable to measure humidity back in the 1860s, but if you've ever visited Gettysburg in Adams County, Pennsylvania during the summer, you know it's incredibly humid. So these men in their wool uniforms are really putting their back into it, and they're grumbling and complaining, thinking, oh my gosh, we're putting all this effort into this. We're not going to use these things. The Confederates aren't going to attack us here. This will all be for nothing. As they're complaining, but working, Jesse Jones recalled exactly how they were constructed. And this is a great sketch of the 149th New York's position on Culp's Hill, and you can get a really idea of what these trenches and earthworks are beginning to look like, these breastworks in Greene's position. Jesse Jones said Culp's Hill was covered with woods. He said, so all the materials needful for this were at our disposal. Right and left, the men felled the trees and blocked them up into a close log fence. Piles of cordwood, which lay nearby, were quickly appropriated. The sticks, set standing on end against the outer face of the logs, made excellent battening. George Collins, again the man pictured here on the bottom left of your screen, also noted that the earthworks included a log that was blocked up on the top to permit a musket to be fired under it, while the log was intended to protect the head. So this sketch really depicts the earthworks in the construction phase. What they've done is they've thrown up a number of logs upright. They've thrown up a number of logs horizontal. They've stacked stones. They've stacked split wood that's around the area. And what they'll do next is they'll add another log, a horizontal log, over top of these positions. And they'll sit on upright rails here that you can see, and the theory behind it is they call them a headlog, is that the soldiers, either kneeling or standing, will be able to place their musket, rest it on this top log here. They'll rest it, stick it out through this hole in the breastworks, and that top log will protect their head and upper body from any incoming fire. So these works are being superintended by George Greene. He's utilizing his knowledge as a civil engineer to look at the ground, see where his position needs more strength, and he's having these men work. And it'll take him about 6 hours to finish all of their preparations. They're digging, they're stacking, they're building. And after about 12 o'clock, these men finally, as you can see here in the foreground, will get a chance to sit, to relax, and to wait to see what happens next. Now, all of this is taking place in Greene's line and the units that are up on Culp's Hill. General Robert E. Lee, commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, is working on a plan for July 2nd. Lee is flush with victory after the conclusion of the Battle of July 1st, and he wants to follow up that success. Lee's plan is this. Lee is going to order a massive flank attack from the Confederate Army's right flank, or the southern end of the battlefield. The goal of this flank assault is to smash into the Union Army's left flank, that's the very end or the very side of an army, and the rear of the Army of the Potomac. a flank and a rear of any organization of men on a battlefield during the Civil War and during the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, during wars throughout history, are always a weak spot in any line. So Lee is going to organize a massive assault towards the Union Army's left flank. But Lee needs to make sure that while his men are attacking the flank and the rear of the Union Army on the southern end of the line, he needs to ensure that no Union soldiers will be taken from places that are not under assault. So Union soldiers at Cemetery Hill, Union soldiers at Culp's Hill. He needs to make sure that those men are not shifted to the threatened area of the Army of the Potomac's left flank and help bolster their line. So Lee's going to come up with a diversionary plan, and the diversionary plan is this. He's going to have a number of units from the Second Corps of the Army of the Potomac under the command of Richard Stoddard Ewell. He's going to have a division under the command of Edward Allegheny Johnson, as well as a division in a division from the Second Corps as well to attack Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill. Now, this is supposed to be a diversionary assault. These Confederates are supposed to get up close to these positions, really make the Union commanders in that area of the field think that they're attacking, think that this is the real deal, so that they will not shift soldiers to help out their comrades in arms on the far southern end of the battlefield. So that's the general plan. Lee will provide a little caveat to that plan by noting that, if this diversionary assault, as these two divisions make their way to Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill respectively, if they get close, they're starting to skirmish, they're starting to fire, and it looks like they'll have a chance of success if they attack the position, then they are to do so. Now, placed in the responsibility of getting that diversionary assault off the ground, or kickoff, if you will, is this young soldier here pictured on the right of your screen, Major Joseph W. Latimer. Latimer is in command of an artillery battalion in the Confederate Second Corps, and his job is to engage and silence Union artillery that is currently sitting atop Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill before this diversionary assault begins. Latimer will have difficulty in finding a position in which to open that bombardment effectively on the Union position. He will eventually find a place known as Benner's Hill. It's not the greatest location. He's wide open on the top of a plateau on the battlefield, and he will suffer what we call converging fire. A number of cannons will all be focusing on him, while he'll have to spread his fire out to the Union line. So it's not a great position. It's the only one he can find, and he will open up that artillery duel. As Latimer does that, on the far end of the field, the main Confederate attack is moving forward. Battle is starting to rage at such places as Devil's Den and the Triangular Field, Stony Ridge and the Wheat Field and the Peach Orchard. And as all of this action is really heating up on the southern end of the battlefield, General Meade is in desperate need of reinforcements. The Union line is giving way on that end of the field, and he needs to send reinforcements to shore it up. So as the fight is unfolding at such places as Little Round Top, here depicted on July 2nd, 1863, the soldier pictured on the left of your screen here, Major General Henry Slocum, the commander of the 12th Corps, he'll receive a dispatch from some Army signal officers stating that a heavy column of Confederate soldiers were moving towards Culp's Hill. Not long after Slocum receives that message, he gets another message, this time from General Meade, there pictured on the right of your screen, ordering Meade to move all the 12th Corps, all those soldiers we showed you on that map on Culp's Hill, to pack them up and move them to the Union left flank down by Little Round Top and Devil's Den and the Wheat Field and the Peach Orchard. General Meade is reporting to Slocum that the left end of the Union line is under heavy attack, that the line is bending, swaying, in some places breaking. We need to send the men from Culp's Hill to Little Round Top in that vicinity. This is exactly what Lee wanted to avoid with that diversionary assault. So Slocum has a really difficult decision. Army intelligence officers are saying, hey, there's a heavy column of Confederate infantry coming your way. General Meade is saying, pack everybody up and leave and head to the other end of the battlefield. Now, in a post-war report, Brigadier General Alpheus Williams, who's kind of serving as the de facto man in charge of the 12th Corps at this moment of the battle, and that's a whole nother day's story, he receives an order from General Slocum to send all the men that he can spare from Culp's Hill, at least a division, to the federal left flank to follow what George Meade wanted, but at the same time still leaving some men on Culp's Hill against Meade's orders. So Slocum at this point has done what he thought was best. But Brigadier General Alpheus Williams, he's concerned. He's really concerned about this order. He's on the ground. He's at Culp's Hill. He's concerned that if he sends even a division towards the Union left, that the Union right flank on Culp's Hill will be weakened, and very weakened to the point that an attack could overrun the position. So Williams rides off to meet with General Slocum on a location known as Powers Hill. And there, General Williams advises Slocum that this is unwise. This order you sent me, not a good idea to save the left. And they have this conversation, and Slocum says, okay, all right, you know what, let's keep some more of the men on Culp's Hill than I originally planned, but we still got to follow what General Meade wants us to do and send some soldiers to the left. So ultimately, it's decided that General John Geary's division, which includes Greene's brigade, will be left behind on Culp's Hill. The rest of the 12th Corps will pack up and head towards Little Round Top. By 7 p.m. on the evening of July 2nd, John Geary would write in his official report of the battle that he had received an order from Slocum about 30 minutes prior, telling him that he needed to leave the hill and that all he could leave behind was one brigade. So Slocum has ordered Williams to send everybody but John Geary's division. Now Slocum sends orders to the commander of that lone division, John Geary, saying leave just Greene's brigade and send the rest to Little Round Top. So the only 12th Corps units that are left on Culp's Hill are Greene's brigade, in addition to the badly mauled units off to his left from the 1st Corps that have been there since the evening of July 1st. When this happens, all those trenches that you saw, that huge line of earthworks that were constructed by all these units throughout the day of July 2nd, are now empty. And General Greene realizes he is in a very tough situation. So the first thing he does is he is going to send out orders to his regiments to help extend his line and fill those earthworks. He's going to order his units to undouble their lines. Think about Civil War regiments going into battle where they're 2 ranks deep, 2 lines as they move across the battlefield. He's going to have them undouble, so that double line is going to extend now into one single line, and it will lengthen the space that Greene's lone brigade can fill at Culp's Hill. Now, as all of this is happening, as Greene has now been left alone, the 12th Corps has gotten a head start towards the Union Army's left flank. Geary's division is now left as well. The Confederates have reached Rock Creek, and those Union skirmishers that had been sent out earlier in the day are now sending that early warning system back to Greene and the men on Culp's Hill that indeed a Confederate attack is making their way towards this position. Heading towards Rock Creek and the skirmishers will be 3 brigades of Confederates of approximately 4,700 men in total. These brigades included Virginians under the command of John Jones, Louisianans under the command of Jesse Williams, and North Carolinian and Marylanders under the command of George Stewart, as well as Virginians. As these 4,700 Confederates approach Rock Creek, as they're making their way to the skirmish line, one soldier, pictured here on your screen, Sergeant Martin Olmsted of the 102nd New York, he recalled the approach of the Confederate advance in December of 1908. He wrote, "Soon regiments of infantry began to appear, and moving forward, they formed in a line of battle to the left of the Confederate guns. Watching these as they came into line through a field glass and counting the battle flags and intervals in the front line, I calculated that there were 8 regiments and of probably from 400 to 500 muskets in each. In the rear of these, who were forming the front line of battle, were 2 smaller lines of infantry, formed some 200 or 300 yards in the rear as supporting columns. On their left flank, as a curtain, were 2 more regiments moving by the left flank in files of 4. Then an officer and staff rode along the front line and must have made some remarks to the men, as I distinctly saw a flutter of battle flags and hats waving in the air. But they were too far away to be heard. Then the whole mass moved out with their arms at a right shoulder shift and their movement in perfect alignment. It wasn't long before the Confederates reached Rock Creek and began to exchange shots back and forth between the Union skirmish line and the Confederate skirmish line leading the Confederate attack. Olmsted again recorded this moment. He said, as soon as the advanced skirmish line came within reach of us, we opened a brisk fire upon it, and the 2 lines of deployed men were soon battered into one blazing line of musketry. The smoke of the battle gathering under the dense foliage of the trees, together with the dusk of the evening, soon brought out to view the flashes of the musketry. And so near us came the solid line of battle at one time that its tramp, tramp, and the sharp, short commands of its officers became clearly audible. From the Confederate line of skirmishers reaching the creek and engaging with Olmsted and his compatriots was a man by the name of John Stone of the 1st Maryland Infantry. He said, scarcely had we reached the creek that runs by the foot of the mountain when we were fired upon by the enemy, who were ambushed nearby. 4 of our company fell wounded and many others along the line. So the Confederate skirmish line has reached Rock Creek. They've engaged Greene's skirmish line. The firing is picking up, and it's time now for the Federal skirmishers to fall back to Greene's main line of battle. Lieutenant Colonel John Reddington, pictured in the center of your screen, of the 60th New York, who was in command of these skirmishers 200-300 yards out in front of Greene's main line of battle, recalled the moment that the skirmish line fell back. He said, I therefore fell back slowly with my 170 men, contesting every inch of ground, the enemy close on our heels and firing occasional volleys at us. The darkness was so great in this part of the woods that we could not see the enemy, and we fired at the flashes of their guns. They were so close to us that we took 12 prisoners. Captain George Collins, again in a post-war image there on the right of your screen, also recalled the moment. He said the skirmishers came running back, followed by a Confederate line of battle, yelping and howling in its peculiar manner. Some of our skirmishers were killed in sight of the brigade, and occasionally a stray bullet came whizzing by the heads of the men in the rifle pits, who were so eager and clamorous that it was all the officers could do to prevent them from firing before the men in the skirmish line could come in. The skirmishers, seeing their danger, cried out in an agonizing and beseeching manner. The Confederate skirmish line has crossed over Rock Creek. The main line of Confederate infantry has crossed over Rock Creek. Darkness is setting on the landscape. There's no daylight savings time during the American Civil War. It's about 7:30, 7:45 at this moment. The black powder smoke from these early exchanges of rifle fire are clinging to the canopy of the trees. It's obscuring what daylight is left, and it's at this moment that General Greene realizes he is in a real dire situation and that he needs help. So he's going to send some of his staff, some aides, to James Wadsworth, the divisional commander in the 1st Corps, and Oliver Otis Howard, the 11th Corps commander, asking them for any and all reinforcements to be sent to his sector of the line on Culp's Hill. General Wadsworth is going to ready his reserve units. These are men that are not on the main line, that are plugged in if there's an emergency. They'll include the 84th New York, the 147th New York, and the 6th Wisconsin. But Wadsworth sends note back with the aides to Greene, says, listen, I'll have them stand at the ready. They're going to be ready to go at a minute's notice, but I can't send them to you because I don't know if this attack that's coming your way is also going to be coming my way. And so until I know that the attack's not going to make its way to my position, I can't send you any help. Howard, the 11th Corps, a little bit further away from these immediate reinforcements for Greene, will acknowledge the request for help. Howard's going to round up about 400 men from 4 different regiments in von Amesberg's brigade, and he's going to send them off to Culp's Hill, but it's going to take time for them to get there. And in the intervening moments, the Confederate attack has reached General Greene's line. Louisianans, under the command of Jesse Williams, would be the first brigade to hit Greene's line near its center, and they'll be the first repulsed by Greene's stout defensive works and the men from New York. One soldier wrote in a New York newspaper, wrote to a New York newspaper on July 9th, just 7 days later, of this moment. He said the rebels advanced and a perfect storm of lead was poured into them, mowing them down like grass. But still the rascals stood their ground well, and they returned fire with interest. Our men, however, were protected by their breastworks, and we consequently suffered comparatively little. Captain Steuben Kuhn of the 60th New York, towards this area opposite the right flank of the Louisianans, recorded this moment when the two lines finally converged upon each other. He said not a shot was fired at them until they got within about 15 rods. Then the order to fire was given, and we did fire, and we kept firing. If ever men loaded and fired more rapidly than the 60th New York did on that occasion, I never saw them do it. The rebels yelled like wild Indians and charged upon us at a double quick. The initial impact on Greene's line, from Williams' Louisianans to the Virginians and the North Carolinians and the Marylanders, are immediately repulsed. Greene has constructed a very stout defensive position. The earthworks are protecting his men. They're suffering relatively few casualties, but there is a problem in Greene's line. You know, if Greene was still had his regiments doubled, if a man in the front ranks was wounded or killed and a hole opened up, a man from the rear would step in and fill that position. But as men in Greene's ranks are now being killed or wounded or knocked out of the fight, there's nobody behind them to fill in. And they're already stretched thin to begin with to fill this large area that has been vacated by other 12th Corps units. So Greene's line is beginning to show gaps here and there. As all this is happening, the 1st Confederate repulse is recovering from their defeat on their first attack. Off in the distance of this sketch here, they're getting ready to attack Greene's line for a second time. On Greene's left flank, further up the slope, a little higher up towards the summit, the Virginians, under the command of Jones, will assault the works for a second time. A captain in the 25th Virginia, a man by the name of C.R. Skinker, recorded the second assault this way. He said, when the order was given, just before we fell back to charge up to the enemy's works, I collected together the only 3 of my men I could find around me with the flag and about 20 more, and we went up the works, where the brave flag bearer fell, and my 3 men, together with nearly all that went up there. Coming back, I discovered the prostrate form of General Jones, our brigade commander, and not being able to find any of my command, I thought the best thing I could would be to assist Major White in carrying him from the field. Within a matter of moments into the second assault, now the Confederate command structure of these individual brigades is beginning to shake as these commanding officers are wounded or killed. But they're not giving up yet. The Confederates will fall back, they'll reform, and they'll try it again a third time. They'll make it even closer to these earthenworks, to these breastworks, but they still can't break the line. They'll fall back, they'll reform, they'll strike a fourth time. And by the time the Confederates make their third and fourth assaults, particularly the Confederate soldiers from Louisiana in the center of the line will abandon this idea of linear tactics, standing shoulder to shoulder, 2 ranks deep, and marching towards the enemy position. The sheer terrain and nature of the ground on Culp's Hill and in and around Greene's position is decimating their formation as they're trying to hold it together as they go forward. And so Williams' Louisianans in that third and fourth attack, they're going to abandon the shoulder-to-shoulder way of fighting. They're going to start fighting from tree to tree, from boulder to boulder, trying to get closer and closer to Greene's line and to ultimately break it and penetrate it. Greene's line, after 2, 3, 4 attacks, is under immense pressure, but Federal reinforcements are finally on the way. A soldier from the 147th New York, one of those First Corps units that James Wadsworth said, I can't give you General Greene until I know I'm not being attacked, recalled the orders finally coming down when Wadsworth released them to send them to Greene's assistance. He said about sundown, the rebels had attacked the rifle pits, and we were ordered to reinforce a part of the line that was hard pressed. It was a hard job to get the men forward in the face of such a fire as they were exposed to in order to reach the pits. The experience of yesterday was a fearful reminder. But they soon started forward, and with a shout at the double quick, we were soon safe under the shelter of a breastwork. So the soldier of the 147th New York is saying, all right, we've been ordered to be ready. We've been standing ready. We finally get the orders to go forward. And not many in our unit, in our brigade, want to go forward at all. These units had been so badly handled by Confederate infantry and artillery on July 1st. That experience had made them what we call in 21st century terms combat ineffective. The commanders were doing all they can to get these men moving forward. And it's taking a lot of work. But once they get them going, they will make their way at a double quick. And you can see here on the left side of this painting depicting the fighting at Culp's Hill, the reinforcements beginning to arrive. In addition to those 355 men making their way from the 1st Corps to help Greene out, 400 men from the 11th Corps have arrived to help them out as well. As all of this is happening, as the Confederates are reforming and charging again, they're making very little to no progress at all. The Union soldiers in Greene's line, despite the line holding, are in a precarious situation. They're running out of ammunition. The 149th New York, whose position is depicted in this painting, was originally issued 60 rounds to go into the fight here at Gettysburg. That's 20 additional rounds that they are normally issued. Union soldiers, Confederate soldiers, their cartridge boxes worn on their hip can hold 40 rounds or 40 cartridges. If you're issued those extra 20 rounds, your places of storage or your trouser pockets, perhaps an inside coat pocket, you could maybe throw them in your haversack or your knapsack. But those are above and beyond rounds, and the men in Greene's line in this defense have gone through them. Ammunition is so low amongst the men in Greene's center of his line around the 149th New York that their commanding officer will order them to fix bayonets. Meanwhile, as the reinforcements are arriving, these men are fixing bayonets. Other soldiers in Greene's line are going up and down the trenches and beginning to pick cartridges off the dead and wounded. Further up the slope from the 149th, the 60th New York is also in the same position. Their commanding officer is ordering them to fix bayonets. Yes, the entrenched position is held, but they're running low on their ability to throw lead down range and to seriously hamper these assaults if any more are coming their way. Now, meanwhile, as the attacks have reached the center of Greene's line, you can see here the 102nd, 149th New York. They've reached the 60th New York, the left of Greene's line. The right end of Greene's line is experiencing something completely different. The Confederates have had much further to go to be able to get to Rock Creek, to get across Rock Creek, and make their advance toward Greene's position. One of the things that happened in particular during the Confederate advance is the brigade has been split as they struggled to cross Rock Creek itself. So this end of Greene's line has not been under fire as the center and his left has multiple times during multiple Confederate assaults. General Stuart, who's in command of this brigade of Confederate soldiers, will recall the delay getting his men into combat. He said, the right wing of our brigade, 1st New York, 37th Virginia, crossed the creek considerably in advance of the center and the left wing, owing to the fact that the order to move by a right half wheel was not immediately understood on the left, and also the greater number of natural obstacles to be overcome by that part of the brigade. So thus, the brigade is split when they go into combat. Now, because of that, as the 1st North Carolina, the 37th New York make their way to this position ahead of the rest of the brigade, the men of the 137th New York, stretched out here, are able to fire into the left flank of these units, as well as the 1st Maryland Battalion, into their flank, which I mentioned earlier is a weak spot in any formation of soldiers on the battlefield. And really, they're able to slow down the assault that is being made by Stuart's men. Not only is the 137th firing into their flank and rear, but the 149th is firing into their front. So these Confederate units are really being just hammered away from the right end of Greene's line. And when Greene's line opens up on them, the Confederates of the 1st Maryland Battalion, the 1st North Carolina, they're going to go to the prone position. They're going to lay down. The fire is too hot. They are unable to return it effectively, and they are going to await the arrival of the rest of the brigade. William Goldsborough, pictured here on the right of your screen in the 1st Maryland Battalion, recalled the devastation that the men of the 137th New York and the 149th were inflicting on the Confederate attack on this end of the line. He said, "Men fell like autumn leaves, but the brave fellows disdained to retreat. The 3rd North Carolina and the 1st Maryland were face to face with the enemy behind a line of log breastworks, and these two regiments received their full fire at a very short range, for owing to the darkness, the breastworks could not be seen. At the same moment, they received an enfilading fire from Greene's New York Brigade, which was posted in an angle of the works." Now, as all of this is taking place, if you look at the bottom of the map, you see this unit, the 10th Virginia. They finally get across Rock Creek, and they're making their way down this fence line here, and they begin to realize that all these new earthworks, these trenches, these breastworks that have been constructed, are vacant of Union soldiers. And they're going to report that back to Stuart, and they're going to let him know, hey, these works are empty. And Stuart realizes his brigade has an opportunity to get on the flank and in the rear of the Federal position at Culp's Hill. So he orders the men of the 10th Virginia, the 23rd Virginia, to follow this stone wall represented by these circles here as their guide to attack the left and rear of Greene's position, or the 137th New York. When it reached there, Greene's men on the right flank are beginning to receive wounds in their side and their rear. And Greene, and in particular the colonel of the 137th New York, David Ireland, realizes that Confederate soldiers are on his flank and in their rear. And Greene is going to refuse his line. You may have heard or recall that from the movie Gettysburg. Colonel Chamberlain at Little Round Top refused his line, and the men swung like a door and swept the Alabamians off the hill. Colonel David Ireland, 137th New York, is going to refuse the end of his line to meet this threat on his flank and in his rear, but it's only a stopgap measure. Casualties are still mounting. More Confederates are arriving on the scene, and the men of the 137th, despite their best efforts, are unable to hold the position. So Greene orders them to fall back to this right here. You can see it labeled as a traverse. A traverse is kind of a fallback position for breastwork construction. That if you're manning the breastworks and an attack comes from a different direction, you can go to these fallback prepared earthworks to face that new direction. And that's exactly what happens. And it's a godsend that someone, and we don't know historically who ordered this traverse to be built on July 2nd, but now the 137th New York is going to take full advantage of them. Ireland orders the 137th New York to fall back to the traverse. The time is now 10 p.m. Lieutenant Samuel Wheelock would write to the Ithaca Journal at the moment. He said, "We took advantage of our own want of support on the right. The Confederates did. A body of rebels had succeeded in turning our right flank. They had gained a position behind a stone wall." You can see that again right here, directly in our rear and not more than 100 yards distant. Owing to the darkness and the nature of the ground, considerable confusion ensued in executing this order. 137th New York falls back. They make their way to the traverse. What is going to happen next? As the 137th New York reaches the traverse, they are now experiencing what the 60th New York and what the 149th New York had experienced early in their fight. They're running low on ammunition. And they need to somehow slow down this assault towards their position. What are they going to do? Well, one of the companies of the 137th New York, Company I, will fix bayonets. They'll jump over the traverse, and they will charge this Confederate attack alone. It will be enough to slow down the assault, to buy more time to get reinforcements to the Traverse and to shore up David Ireland and the 137th New York. Arriving to the scene was the 84th New York of Lysander Cutler's brigade, as well as the 6th Wisconsin of the famed Iron Brigade. As these men arrive here to the lower saddle, they, with the 137th New York, will slam into Stuart's attack. It will decimate any momentum that Stuart had, and it will end the fighting on this sector of the line. At 11 p.m., Greene's men are finally well enough reinforced that they are able to have ammunition replenished. They're able to clean their fouled guns, which at this point are so clogged with black powder, they're struggling to get rounds down the muzzle and down the barrel. And as they are beginning to get their ammunition replenished and reinforcements are beginning to take over, finally they will be pulled off the main line after this heroic stand on Culp's Hill by themselves. The cost was immense, both to General Greene as well as to the men of the Confederate brigades that attacked the position. Out of the 4,700 Confederate soldiers that attacked Greene's position, 1,469 of them had become casualties. The highest losses were in Stuart's brigade that had attacked the men of the 137th New York. So the 137th really did an incredible job of holding that line against all odds and at all costs, and inflicting a heck of a ton of casualties and making Stuart's men pay for any ground they did gain. Greene's brigade overall lost about 21% of the men that were on the field that evening of July 2nd. Captain George Collins would later write a regimental history of one of Greene's units on the 149th New York, and he very accurately and poignantly describes the aftermath of this battle in the darkness of July 2nd and into the morning of July 3rd. He said, at first the killed were tenderly put out back and out of the way during the battle, but afterwards attention was given only to the wounded unable to get off the field without help. Occasionally the dead were tossed from underfoot, but in most instances many remained where they fell, and they were sat upon by men while loading their pieces. The bodies of the killed commenced to putrefy at once, so that at the close of the engagement the stench was almost insufferable. Most of the wounded were injured about the head and upper parts of the body, as the lower extremities were covered by the breastworks. Most of the companies would average at least one man killed or wounded every time it went in or out of combat. The 137th New York would lose 75 men, almost 1 in 5 of every of their soldiers that went into the battle, but they had inflicted 7-1 casualties, as I mentioned, on Stuart's brigade. Jesse Jones, writing about the importance of the breastworks, Greene's decision to buck his commanding officer, John Geary, and have these things constructed. He said, Jones said that had the breastworks not been built, and there had been only a thin line of the unprotected brigade, that line must have been swept away like leaves before the wind by the oncoming of so heavy a mass of troops, and the Baltimore Pike would have been reached by the enemy. July 2nd will move into July 3rd. Greene's men will once again be under assault, but they will be joined by the 12th Corps, the rest of the 12th Corps, who have made their way back from their journey to Little Round Top. To wrap up that story, they got lost on their march from Culp's Hill to Little Round Top. They arrived to Little Round Top long after the battle had ended, long after it had become dark. Union commanders at Little Round Top, receiving the help of the units of the 12th Corps, said, thanks for coming, we appreciate it, but you're not needed here any longer. You can turn around and march back. They will be making their way back into position in the early morning hours at about 4:30 a.m. on the morning of July 3rd, and the battle for Culp's Hill will resume. Before I end the program tonight, I want to talk a little bit about the reflections that many had on General Greene and the efforts of his men on his fighting on July 2nd. The New Yorkers had repelled 4 different charges, and they were still intact as a fighting force when the battle came to an end on July 2nd and went back in to the battle there on July 3rd. General Greene did not like to receive praise. He made sure that all of that praise was directed at his officers and men. He did not believe that what he had contributed and what he had done that evening was the sole reason for success. Greene wrote in his report to be submitted to Army headquarters, quote, "The officers and men behaved admirably during the whole of the contest. Colonel Ireland was flanked on his flank and rear. He changed his position and maintained his ground with skill and gallantry, and his regiment suffered very severely." But Greene continued, he said, "Where all so well did their duty, it is difficult to specially commend any individual from my command. But all have my hearty commendations for their gallant conduct and for the good service rendered their country." Despite Greene heaping praise on his men, many of the commanding officers above him in the 12th Corps and throughout the Army of the Potomac realized what Greene had done on the evening of July 2nd. Brigadier General Thomas Kane wrote in his report on July 2nd that the noble veteran Greene, by his resistance against overwhelming odds, should be remembered that he saved the Army. Greene's division commander, John Geary, wrote in his report on July 29th, he said, "Greene's brigade behaved with the most unflinching gallantry. They sustained their desperate position during an incessant attack of 2.5 hours from vastly superior numbers." He would go on to talk about the heaps of rebel dead and wounded in front of the lines. That was an indicator of Greene's desperate stand. Brigadier General Alpheus Williams wrote in his report of the battle on August 22nd that Greene had seized with skill and judgment the advantages of his position. He held it with his small brigade against overwhelming numbers with signal gallantry and determination, and that he deserves special mention for the faithful and able manner in which he conducted the defense. Major General Henry Slocum, in command of the 12th Corps, wrote in his report a day later on August 23rd, he said, "General Greene handled his command with great skill and his men fought with gallantry, never surpassed by any troops under my command." But if you don't believe all the officers in the 12th Corps that served with Greene, either alongside him as fellow brigadiers, command of other brigades, division commanders, as his corps commander, if you don't trust them for an accounting of what Greene and his men accomplished on July 2nd, 1863, maybe you will trust the words of General James Longstreet, commander of the 1st Corps of the Army of Northern Virginia, whose men had assaulted Devil's Den and the Triangular Field and Little Round Top and the Peach Orchard. In a speech at Gettysburg in 1893, General Longstreet, quote, "conceded to Greene's brigade the credit of having successfully prevented the Confederates from turning General Meade's right flank." General Sickles, the self-proclaimed hero of the Battle of Gettysburg, not willing to share that limelight with just anyone that had served in the Union Army at the battle, said that the stubborn resistance of Greene alone saved the Union Army from disaster at Gettysburg. So the self-proclaimed hero of Gettysburg is heaping onto Greene the praise of saving the Union Army from disaster at the battle. And tonight I'd like to close the program with a quote from a speech that was given at the dedication of the monument to George Sears Greene at the summit of Culp's Hill. And I think it's such an important moment in this dedication that not only sums up the story of General Greene and his men on July 2nd, 1863, but also reminds us in the 20th and the 21st century that this story has largely been forgotten. Visitors today flock to Little Round Top. They flock to Cemetery Ridge. They study in minute detail the actions there and at Pickett's Charge. Very rarely do they go to Culp's Hill, visit this position, and know the story of Greene and his New Yorkers. And so tonight I'll close with these following words. Quote, "These who are now present," and in 2020 and 2021 it has mostly been virtually, but tonight, you who are now present on this virtual presentation, you remind this current generation the debt it owes to the soldiers like Greene and his men who won the victory for the Union. They won it not only for themselves, but for the millions who enjoy the fruits of the triumph gained at the cost of so many thousands of lives. Thank you for joining me this evening as we learned a little bit more about George Sears Greene and the important role that he and his men from New York played on the evening of July 2nd, 1863. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here at the moment, and I will turn it back over to Mark to help facilitate any questions that you all may have.
Thanks very much, Dan. It was quite good. We have some questions already. And again, as other people have questions, please add them. Are there going to be any presentations by the park rangers on Culp's Hill or any other battlefield sites this coming July during the upcoming anniversary?
It's a great question. We actually just received clearance from our regional director that we are allowed to resume programming. So programming here at Gettysburg will start again this coming Saturday, as a matter of fact. It will not look exactly like it has in years past. We normally offer about 20 to 22 programs a day in years past all over the battlefield. We'll be starting things off slowly with about 5 to 6 programs a day and slowly build from there. As far as the battle anniversary goes, we are still working, coming up very quickly with a plan. We were not expecting to be able to be allowed to have those programs this year due to regional guidance based on COVID restrictions. So we are working on that. For the anniversary programs, as well as these programs that start this Saturday, I would encourage you to check the park's website, and the park's Facebook page will have that full schedule of events posted very soon. I believe tomorrow that information will go live. As far as programs on Culp's Hill in particular, unfortunately, we are not planning any Culp's Hill specific programs this year. I know for a number of years I have done an extended battle walk of George Sears Greene on Culp's Hill, kind of telling the stories that we heard this evening, but those longer extended programs are not yet added to our schedule. But what the Park Service has done, it has provided a new trail on Culp's Hill during the restoration over the last several months, with interpretive way signs along that trail, showing you a little bit more of where the Confederate attack was launched from, where different units were located, and gathering that view as you make it up to Greene's position. So if you do come, you can pick up a little brochure and you can follow the new trail and read the way signs from the bottom of the Confederate attack up to Greene's line at the crest and summit of Culp's Hill.
That's great news, though, that things are starting to resume normality there.
Absolutely.
Several questions related to the diversionary attack. First of all, do you think if Longstreet's attack had actually occurred earlier in the day as originally intended, it would have made any difference to the outcome of the diversionary attack? Great question. Yeah, so to recap that, General Longstreet doesn't have all of his men in position on the morning of July 2nd. It's going to take some time for his men to get into position. He doesn't have all of the First Corps with him. General Pickett's division is still miles to the rear. So there's a long delay in waiting for the main Confederate assault under Longstreet on the southern end of the battlefield towards the Union Army's left flank to get underway. At the same time, however, Major Joseph Latimer, in charge of the 2nd Corps Artillery Battalion that's going to be leading off, opening this diversionary assault, is struggling to find an artillery platform in which to silence the Confederate batteries Union batteries on Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill. So even if Longstreet was able to roll this assault forward a little bit earlier in the day, I don't think Latimer's battalion would have been ready. By the time that Latimer finally finds the position, he has to go and report to his commanding officer, Allegheny Johnson, in command of the division, who reports to Ewell. He gets it approved, and then he asks these guys, he says, listen, this position's very exposed. As soon as I pull my batteries up here, I'm going to be receiving fire from anywhere. So I can't go forward until you give me the okay that the infantry's going forward. And that all hinges on Longstreet. The diversionary assault is supposed to go forward once they hear Longstreet's men engaged on the other end of the battlefield. That doesn't happen. That part of the plan fails for a whole host of reasons. But I don't think that the diversionary assault would have had any more chance of success
because Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill was already an incredibly stout position for the Union Army at the close of July 1st and throughout the morning of July 2nd as more Union reinforcements arrived on the field.
Now, you mentioned that Lee's intent had been for it to be a diversionary attack, but if the commanders on the ground felt it was possible, they were to turn it into a real assault. So did that happen that evening? I mean, or were the local commanders still seeing this as a diversionary attack?
So the diversionary assault, known to in Lee's order as a feint or a demonstration. One of the things that Lee does at Gettysburg, which is very peculiar, is Lee puts these caveats in his orders. The most famous is on July 1st, when he tells Richard Stoddert Ewell to take that hill if practicable. You know, we always say, well, if, you know, Jackson was in command of the Second Corps at Gettysburg, he would have taken that hill. It would have been practicable, and, you know, the battle would have been over. The Confederates would have won. Ewell is not Jackson. And Ewell is the type of commander that requires explicit instruction. And so when Lee says take the hill if practicable, Ewell will send out a reconnaissance, and he'll determine if it's practicable or not, and eventually decides he can take care of it on the morning of July 2nd. Again, with this order to Ewell on July 2nd, you know, Lee puts another caveat, this caveat that, hey, we want this to be a feint demonstration. So basically, Ewell's job is to make it look like a massive all-out attack is coming against the Union position on Culp's and Cemetery Hill. You know, these Confederate soldiers are supposed to march up to the line, get real close to the Union line, look like we're going to have this big brawl back and forth, but we're not. And essentially what that does is it pins the butterfly's wings to that part of the chessboard or that part of the game board. That those men, those Union soldiers are like, we're going to be under attack. We can't possibly leave this position and go help out our comrades at the other end of the line that are being pushed back. But again, Lee puts that caveat on there that, hey, look, when you get close to those lines and you're threatening, like we're going to have this big fight here, if things look good, turn it into the real deal and capitalize on any weaknesses that might be there. And I think that those commanders on the ground saw numerous things that told them that it could be turned into a full-on assault, and it's exactly what happened. At Cemetery Hill, the brigades of Hoke, under the command of Isaac Avery, North Carolinians, and the Louisianans under the command of Harry Hayes, they make their way towards the Union position on the eastern slopes of Cemetery Hill, and they say, "Oh my goodness, look! You know, we're not receiving a lot of resistance here." That part of the line had been thinned out. There were gaps. One soldier at Cemetery Hill refers of gaps of 14 yards between individual soldiers at the base of the eastern slope of Cemetery Hill. So when the Confederates arrived there, you know, some Confederates just walk right through the Union line or cresting Cemetery Hill. So, you know, that's a sign that this could be successful. For the Confederates on Culp's Hill, although those initial attacks are repulsed and they reform and attack again, I think there's a feeling that this line, despite these stout works, will break. Again, if you're a Confederate soldier, you're not seen two ranks deep behind these lines, and as those Union soldiers in those ranks are being killed or wounded, you're starting to see holes pop up along these lines. So I think that there's a feeling in the Confederate command of the three brigades on the evening of July 2nd that attacked Culp's Hill that there's a very good chance that we can capture this position. And clearly that pans out with the discovery of the 10th Virginia of the abandoned earthworks and the ability to get on the flank and the rear of Greene's line. And they will hold those earthworks until the morning of July 3rd. So yeah, there's definitely things that the commanders on the ground are reading that push them forward and really convert this into an attack. Unfortunately, it's not the all-out assault that was envisioned. Robert Rhodes's division does not leave the town of Gettysburg. They're supposed to be making a diversionary assault on the western slopes of Cemetery Hill. Those men don't get up and going until after the battle is over. Again, a story for a whole nother day. A number of brigades, including Georgians under the command of John B. Gordon, do not go forward to support Hayes and Avery on East Cemetery Hill. Hayes and Avery's men capture the summit of Cemetery Hill and hold it for about 20 minutes. They're less than 40 yards from the Baltimore Pike. Gordon's men are told to stand down. Jubal Early, the division commander, says, yeah, those guys are getting slaughtered up there. If you went forward, it would just be a waste of life to your command, so you don't have to go forward. So there's a number of things that break down the envisioned full-on assault that this could have been turned into, that ultimately hamper, in my opinion, what would have been a pretty sound Confederate success on July 2nd.
So one question we had, you've mentioned the Confederate artillery. We have a question about, were there Union batteries engaged that night, or was this infantry, basically an infantry defense?
Yeah, so I'm very biased. I like underdog stories. You won't see me do a lot of presentations on Little Round Top or Pickett's Charge. They get a lot of attention. We know those names and those stories well. So for this story, in my opinion, the artillery duel that opens up between the Confederate and Union artillery on the evening of July 2nd is much more important and much more impressive than what happens before Pickett's Charge on July 3rd. The Union accounts of the Union artillery on Cemetery and Culp's Hill that engage Latimer's guns once he opens up, as well as the Union infantry station there, say that Latimer's guns will, during the course of that artillery duel, will have some of the most accurate artillery fire at any moment during the war. They inflict such heavy damage to the Union guns on Cemetery Hill that several batteries are pulled off the main line and new batteries are brought up to replace them. Unfortunately, Latimer's position is one where Latimer's guns are able to spread out their fire to all these Union guns on Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill. Latimer has to fire out in numerous directions, whereas the Union artillery positioned on Culp's Hill and Cemetery are all firing towards one position of Latimer, where Latimer's guns on, known as converging fire. This artillery duel will go on for 90 minutes. It's going to expend a heck of a lot of ammunition. Latimer's battalion alone will fire 1,400 rounds in 90 minutes in this artillery duel. The highest casualties in any artillery battery during the war will occur during this artillery duel in the Union batteries on Cemetery Hill. So this is a vicious, vicious artillery duel that is incredibly accurate on both sides. So the duel itself is about 90 minutes. After the duel slackens off, Latimer's going to pull his guns out. The Union artillery pretty much becomes silent. It's even more so as the Confederate infantry get closer to the positions, because the guns cannot depress their muzzles enough to be able to strike the Confederate infantry without hitting their own men in the back. What we see on Cemetery Hill is several of the guns are captured by the Confederate soldiers. They're turned around. There's a severe fight for the guns, hand-to-hand fighting between Louisianans, North Carolinians, and Union soldiers on Cemetery Hill. At Culp's Hill, even though the Virginians were able to capture a portion of the entrenchments, they were not close enough to breaking the line at the summit to reach the Union artillery up there.
So we'll have one final question, which is, question is, I'm sure you've walked the new viewscape at Culp's Hill. So what are your thoughts? Why don't you do that for our closing?
It will completely change our understanding of the fight at Culp's Hill for the next generation of historians. Culp's Hill was not it has a very interesting preservation history to it. And so it wasn't, very important in the later half of the 19th century and throughout most of the 20th century. So trees were allowed to grow up, underbrush was allowed to grow up very thickly. These were things that were not there in 1863 because woodlots were being actively utilized. You'd take your farm animals over there and let them graze on all that underbrush, so you'd be able to see 100, 150 yards through these trees, these woodlots on the battlefield. And the woodlots were also actively culled. Property owners would, perhaps they didn't want a certain species of tree on their property, they'd go out and eliminate it. They're culling these trees for firewood for their home or to sell. They're culling them for fences and repairs on their houses. So this restored landscape will give you the most accurate representation of what the Confederates experienced and what Greene's men saw since the battle in the last 158 years. So the landscape has been completely transformed. It also is helping, when we do projects like this, we also do archaeology. And what we're discovering is a lot of things that we didn't previously know. One of the speculations was where were the Confederates exactly? When did they open fire? Where were their battle lines? And the archaeology is helping to change that knowledge for us in the 21st century. We're finding where spent bullets that have been fired from Greene's position, landed in abundance. So that tells you they're firing at a target. We're seeing dropped bullets that weren't fired from Confederate cartridge boxes. That tells us that there's a standing line of battle there, and they're rapidly going through ammunition. We're also learning from the archaeology and the reviewed restoration that some of the long-held understandings of the Confederate attack on Culp's Hill may have been wrong. Mark, you've got a great background there, one of the famous paintings based on a sketch of Greene's fight on July 2nd. There's a famous rock known as Ford Rock. And Edwin Forbes was a sketch artist. He made a sketch of it and later a painting, and it depicts Confederate soldiers taking shelter behind this from the withering storm of Greene's men. But what the renewed landscape has showed us is that if they would have taken cover behind that rock, they were completely exposed. Because of Greene's position and the way the terrain is, they would still be able to be fired upon and hit behind this rock. So it's actually a little low-lying area, 20, 30 yards to the rear that we haven't seen in 158 years. That is telling us where they took shelter. And the archaeology, again, is supporting that, where the bullets are landing and where the bullets are dropping. So if you don't have a trip planned here to Gettysburg this summer or this fall, I urge you to get back here as soon as you can and take advantage of this opportunity to see what Greene's men did 158 years ago, to see what they saw, walk the new trail, walk in the footsteps of the men from Virginia, Louisiana, North Carolina, and Maryland. It is an experience that you'll never forget, to say the least, and you'll honor these men by doing it.
Thank you so much, Dan. I think you can see from some of the comments how much people appreciate this, and how for many people it's really a new story and a new angle on Gettysburg, a battle in which we've heard a lot of stories.
Indeed.
So thank you very much. And to everybody here, have a great summer, and we're going to see you all in September, and we'll let you know as soon as we know where we're going to see you in September.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, everyone.
Outstanding. Thank you.
Thank you.